You're listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. The Rewilding Earth podcast is supported by businesses such as Patagonia, Catula, and Biohabitats, as well as the Whedon Foundation and listeners like you. If you love the work that the Rewilding Institute is doing, please consider donating at rewilding.org. And be sure to sign up for our weekly newsletter while you're there. Stuart Pimm is the founder and president of Saving Nature and the Doris Duke Professor of Conservation at Duke University. His books include The Balance of Nature and, in 2001, the acclaimed World According to Pimm, A Scientist Audits the Earth. He's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the recipient of the 2006 Heineken Prize for Environmental Sciences from the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences, and the winner of the Tyler Prize for Environmental Achievement in 2010. And this year, Stuart was awarded the 2019 International Cosmos Prize, which is widely viewed as one of the most prestigious honors presented in the environmental field. The honor recognizes Pimm's groundbreaking research on endangered species, as well as his work to promote practical approaches to help slow or reverse species declines by protecting and restoring shrinking habitats. I asked Stuart to begin today by talking about his recent article for rewilding.org on the Amazon fires.
The trip from the United States to Brazil is usually overnight, but there's just one or two flights that go in the daytime. And you head southeast out over Florida, and then you cross the Caribbean, and then you get to South America. And the first couple of hours as you go across, southern Venezuela and northern Brazil, it can be magical. It's still one of the last wild places on Earth. There's great rivers, there's huge tepuis, these strange mountain platforms that rise up out of the lowlands, and you go on like that, seeing very few signs of human domination until you get to Manaus on the Amazon, which is a big, ugly city. And then you've got a little bit more of the Amazon as you go south of Manaus, but then you get to this site of immense destruction. That you see so much of the rainforest going up in smoke. You see these huge plumes of smoke that rise up to the height of the plain. And this year is particularly bad because of the new policies of President Jair Bolsonaro. And so I was motivated to write something about that, because I think it's something people need to understand and understand the consequences of it.
Yeah, and every year there's a fire season there for a reason. They call it fire season, but it's just so much worse this year.
It is. This is very much the burning season. It's the dry season, so the forest is more flammable. And the reason that I felt motivated to write something was his sort of denial of the scientific facts. And the reality is that we are now so much better informed about what's going on to our planet. We've got really good remote sensing. Many nations of the world have got satellites up there. We Americans do, Europeans do, the Chinese do, the Indians do. And so we really know what's going on. And fires are really pretty simple to detect from space. They quite literally glow in the dark. I mean, they glow even brighter in the infrared. So we can count the fires and we know exactly where they are. And so, of course, we know that there's a lot more fires now than this time last year, and certainly before Bolsonaro took office.
The head of the space agency in Brazil reporting and sort of giving it away. Here's our map. Here's what we see in fires. And this is from our own Brazilian data. And the guy got sacked right away. And I know other people who do that. There are a lot of leaders around the world now who just get rid of the people who are not towing the line. And it kind of was an admission of guilt right there to me.
I agree, and I think it's very worrying because there used to be a time when you might have politicians with whom you disagreed, but they, I think, understood that that there's facts out there. There is a consensus on what's truthful about the news. What are the things we know? What are the things we don't know? And that notion that as it were, you watch the nightly news and Walter Cronkite tells you the way it is. That's gone. And we've gone to nightly news that you pick which view of the world you want. And that was bad. But the notion that somehow that the scientific facts are up for grabs too is deeply concerning. I mean, global climate disruption, global heating, is not a political statement. It's a set of very well documented scientific facts. And when we burn the Amazon, we know in exquisite detail how many fires, where they are, how they burn, how long they burn for. All of that information is not something that is there for political spin. And shame on politicians to think that they can say that the Earth is flat or whatever, just because that matches their constituents' prior beliefs. Interestingly, there's been items on the news that say that there are fewer fires now than in the past, and that's true too. But again, you can go to readily available satellite data, stuff that anybody can download from the web, and see that a lot of the changes have to do with changes in Africa. And those changes, too, are alarming. That there is a huge swath of Africa stretching from sea to shining sea, from Dakar to Mogadishu, all the way 4,000 miles from the Atlantic to the Indian Ocean. And that area of dry savannas is burning less than in the past. And that's because more people are moving into those areas to try and eke out a miserable subsistence of agriculture in areas that are really too dry for crops. And that's suppressing the fires because the fires were set by graziers who wanted better grazing for their animals. But it hardly represents an improvement of people's lives. And all the way across that region from through Nigeria, across to the Central African Republic, to South Sudan, to Somalia and northern Kenya. All of those places, we hear tales of appalling brutality and massacres as peoples clash over exploiting very, very poor land. So there may be fewer fires, but it doesn't mean that people are living better lives. Far from it.
Boy, is everything tied to everything else. And gathering that information, it's not education to say that there are fewer fires. It's education to say what you said, to come to the realization and do your due diligence to find out why that isn't a good thing.
I think that's very, very serious that people take on whatever nonsense is spewed out by whichever news source that they want without ever checking. And while you can't stop people from being stupid, you can, I think, have and must hold politicians accountable. Politicians are going to make decisions that we don't like, but on the other hand, we expect politicians to weigh the various alternatives with the best scientific evidence that they have at their disposal. And the notion that they can dismiss the fact that species are going extinct, the fact that the climate is warming, all these other things suggests a reckless incompetence that we simply cannot tolerate. make tough decisions, certainly, but ignore the facts, and we do so at our peril. And, I can't help but think that this happened. I mean, I wrote that piece at a time when an enormous hurricane was killing what I'm afraid is going to be an enormous number of people in the Bahamas, where it was plowing into the coastal areas of North Carolina. Are big, powerful hurricanes becoming more common? Yes. Are they moving more slowly? Yes. There's a lot of that kind of thing going on. And if our politicians ignore it, the insurance companies are not, because they know they have to get the facts right or go out of business. A lot of people are going to be economically harmed, if not devastated, by our ignoring what's happening to our climate.
Another thing that seems to have taken place, you mentioned Walter Cronkite and an era when we trusted science and we got our news from far more reliable sources. Though they made mistakes, it was nothing, intentional. And it seems more intentional these days. It's not a mistake. They just spread misinformation sometimes, or all the time.
Indeed.
Depending on the channel you're watching. But the other thing is that I think politicians are learning that if you want to be very bold and do stuff like Bolsonaro is doing, like Trump is doing, they're not getting in trouble for much of anything because a hurricane is coming or another disaster or another distraction. And we are already not talking about the Amazon or much about Africa, the fires on social media. It's gone. The hurricane blew in and then wiped the Amazon issue, the fire stuff right off of social media. And people haven't gone back to it either, though the hurricane is still a developing issue because we're dealing with the aftermath. The news cycle doesn't have time to circle back to anything. And what the effect is, and I'm afraid that these guys know it, I'm afraid the politicians know that everything is so chaotic. And if you keep throwing things at people, they'll never be able to nail you down for any one really big problem that you create.
Well, they may have, but I think we have to learn that we have to hold their feet to the fire, as it were, and make sure that we engage them on the issues that matter. I mean, what we've been talking about so far has been unrelentingly depressing, and for good reason. It is unrelentingly depressing. On the other hand, there are so many things that we can do that I wouldn't want people to go away with a message that it's too late to do anything. Let's talk about what we as individuals can do and what difference we can make, because I think that's a story that needs to be told, and that's a story that isn't being told anywhere near effectively enough.
Your organization, Saving Nature, and everyone can find that at savingnature.com. Give us a little bit of background on it, and let's talk about those solutions that your organization is involved with.
Well, savingnature.com was formed this July, but it came out of 12 years of working with an organization called Saving Species, which I founded 12 years ago with money I got from the Royal Netherlands Academy of Arts and Sciences. There's no Nobel in the environmental field, but that Nobels are given by the Royal Swedish Academy. But the Royal Netherlands Academy gives a wonderful prize out to people doing environmental studies, and I was enormously honored to get it in 2006. And in 2006, I founded an organization devoted to helping conservation groups in species-rich countries, places like Colombia and Ecuador and Brazil and India and Sumatra. And it was driven by science. The science of conservation tells us that there are special parts of the world that hold exceptional numbers of species at risk of extinction. Those places that I've just mentioned are some of them. And people can see that by going to a wonderful website created by the Vice President of Saving Nature, Professor Clinton Jenkins. And it's biodiversitymapping.org, www.biodiversitymapping.org. And what Clinton has done, and I've been part of this, is to try and map out the places that really matter. Within the United States, the southeastern United States, for example, is an area that has large numbers of species that are not found anywhere else. When we go to those places, I mean, when I'm flying across the Amazon, I'm heading to southeastern Brazil. And when I get there, I see a landscape that's massively fragmented. The only forest that remains is in small pieces, in fragments, in tatters. And what we know from studying what happens to species in fragments is that species drop out of fragments over time. There's local extinctions. And there's local extinctions for reasons we understand very well. If you have, a small fragment nearby that has two males in it, and you have a fragment a little bit further off that has two females in it, you do not need a PhD in biology to know that you're not going to get any babies. What we can do is to reconnect fragments, to reforest landscapes so that we restore the connectivity between once isolated areas of habitat. Our motto is CPR for Earth: connect, protect, restore. And by reconnecting landscapes, we can make a huge amount of difference to species.
So what does that look like on the ground? How hard, what are the challenges that you have to doing that? What kinds of alliances do you need to make in order to make one of these CPR projects go?
Well, the first thing we do is we identify the kinds of places where we want to work. Coastal Brazil is a good example. And we then identify the landscapes that we would like to reconnect. And in doing that, we often find that there are wonderful, fantastically enthusiastic, passionate local conservation groups that not anywhere near enough people have heard about. And our mission is to raise money for them so that they can acquire land and reforest it. And that's what we started doing a dozen years ago in coastal Brazil. We saw a piece of land that was a cattle pasture. I mean, just wretched pasture. The cattle were starving on this pasture. It's not very, very good grazing. And we thought, we've got to buy that piece of land. And the reason we thought that is that cattle pasture isolated an area of about 5,000 acres that was a nature reserve, the Union Biological Reserve. And because that nature reserve was isolated, we knew that species within it would eventually, drop out, that there would be these kind of accidents where you get, all individuals of one sex or by chance, too many individuals of a species die and the population isn't viable. A whole variety of processes that befall tiny populations. So we knew the solution was to buy this cattle pasture, reforest it, and connect that nature reserve, that isolated nature reserve, to forest elsewhere. It turns out that forest was uphill, which meant that we knew with global climate disruption that the species would be able to move upslope to cooler climates. And so we get sort of, we achieve three goals, probably four goals. First of all, I shouldn't forget that we provide income for the local community because they collect seeds and have nurseries for the trees that we plant. We are allowing species to be rescued because they're no longer in these isolated fragments. We are allowing them to disperse. We're allowing them to move uphill, upslope, which is vital for addressing the issue of climate change. And we're also planting trees, which soaks up carbon out of the atmosphere. So we felt that this idea of CPR, of connect, protect, restore, was just a win-win-win-win solution for taking care of biodiversity and doing what we can to mitigate against climate disruption.
What does a piece of moonscape that's already been decimated by cows, the way that you've described, is that expensive land? Is it something that would be easy to acquire?
The tragedy is that much of the land that we buy is really cheap land. It isn't really good for much. It really can grow carbon, more economically than it can grow cattle. We reckon that $100 donation to saving nature a year is enough to offset your average American's carbon emissions. In a piece that I wrote about this lovely young woman Greta Thunberg, who sailed across the Atlantic so that she wouldn't burn carbon as she flew in the plane. I joked unkindly, I think, that she probably spent more money on seasickness pills than it would have cost for her to plant trees. I know why she did it, and she's a wonderful inspiration. The reality is that it doesn't cost a lot to help organizations like mine plant trees in the right parts of the world and soak up enough carbon to offset the carbon emissions. I confess that I spend a lot more money on coffee each year than I do on offsetting carbon, and I offset a lot of carbon. It's something we can do, and if we do it in a smart way, if we do it in the right places, we reconnect these landscapes in tropical biodiverse countries, we can make an enormous difference towards, solving the extinction crisis. It's a matter of being smart. And I think that's why we have to have good science, and that's why we have to listen to what the science has to tell us.
Well, we can go back to that distrust that's well earned from media. It seems to end at the disaster headline. So in social media, if you use that as a gauge as to how people are feeling, it feels like they read the headlines and then comments come through that are like just kind of depressed, like, wow, I'm disappointed in humanity, these kinds of things. And I have a new tool, thank you very much, to be able to, when these discussions come up, talk about that $100 a year idea of offsetting, that could do really good. And I want people to then want to know more information, and I'll have a place to send them. And maybe that's what's happening here. That's why I'm so happy about having you on today.
In an inconvenient truth, Al Gore talks about species going extinct 1,000 times faster than they should. Now, you might ask, from whom did he get that? And the answer is from me. And it's my work that shows how fast species are going extinct. But that means that when journalists phone me up, they usually want me to talk about all the depressing news. I don't want to do that because I want to talk about solutions. I mean, I'm sometimes asked, how on earth do you get up in the morning? Well, I get up in the morning because there's so much to do. There are so many things we can do as individuals. There's so many things we can do as a society that are not outrageously expensive, are not impossible. We have the mission of ensuring that our children and our grandchildren have the same biologically rich planet that we inherited from our parents. And I find that enormously exciting and invigorating. And and I'm privileged to be in a position to effect some very cost-effective solutions to that.
If someone were to say, Stuart, we want to fund the work that you're doing, we're really interested in landscape connectivity, wildlands connectivity, and restoration, and we want to give you $1 billion. What would $1 billion do for the planet, given what you have on your maps and the projects you have and the projects that are likely to come up as you continue to research? What would $1 billion do for the planet if 100 could do so much?
This is a very difficult question. It's the one question that keeps me awake at night. And the reason why is if you look at the major conservation organizations, together they have a budget that's probably something close to $2 billion a year. I think the challenge is not so much how much money you raise, but how well you spend it. And so the challenge is, could I spend $1 billion? Yes. The challenge would be, could I spend $1 billion wisely? And I think the answer to that is yes, but my solution would not be to have a large organization, living in a very nice office building inside the Washington, D.C. Beltway or New York City or anywhere else. I better name a number of cities so that nobody thinks I'm picking on them. The challenge is how you get the money to where it matters. How do you get the right tooth to tail ratio? You don't want all the money in the tail. You want money in the teeth that are going to be biting into the problem. And I think what we've done well at Saving Nature is to engage a spectacular array of small, passionate, and very competent groups of people who are actually doing the work in the field. I mean, there's a parallel here to development in how do you raise the standard of living of poor people. The difficulty is not how much money you raise, but how you can spend it wisely. And I'm certain that's true of conservation. I think the challenge would be, how to distribute that money into the places that matter. And so were some billionaire to phone me up and say, Stuart, I'm about to write a check, the challenge for me would be how to get that into the hands of Pat Wright doing work on lemurs in Madagascar, Rudy Patra doing work on orangutans in Sumatra, the Golden Tamarin Association in Brazil, the Hummingbird Conservancy in northern Colombia. Dozens of absolutely fantastic local groups of people like that, all doing a great job, all doing it on peanuts, and getting the money to them in the way that they would make the difference. I think the other challenge, of course, is to how you verify that. And we at Saving Nature put a huge amount of effort into make sure that people can see our progress. Looking at satellite imagery, we're now doing a lot of drone imagery. I think we need to be asking from the conservation community, how do you show what you've done? How do you demonstrate success? And, do we make mistakes? Yes. We haven't always done as good with some of our projects as we could have done. We've learned from our lessons, but we've been really pretty hard-nosed about making sure that we're collecting the data so that we know the difference between success and failure.
It would be really interesting somewhere in the future to be able to partially demonstrate what you've done with those same satellites that are monitoring the fires. But they're a lot greener in areas that you have done work in, yes.
I would encourage people to go to our website and look at our Brazil page. The oldest project that we've done started out in Brazil, and that cattle pasture that I talked about that once isolated the Union Biological Reserve is now a forest. It's now a habitat corridor. And you can see before and after satellite photographs of that restoration. And that's the kind of aggressive transparency that characterizes what we do. I want our donors to know that they're not just, giving me, giving Saving Nature a donation of $100 to plant trees. I want to be able to say, hey, go to this location on Google Earth, and you'll see the forest coming back that you've helped support.
Yes.
And I think that's the challenge. The challenge for conservation is yes, we need more money, but we need to spend it well, and we need to give people a sense that they're achieving real progress. Nothing, absolutely nothing, gives me more pleasure in life than doing what I did about 3 weeks ago in Brazil, which is to walk into a field and it's full of baby trees. Because I know, in 5 years' time, there will be a forest of very young trees, and in 20 years' time, there'll be a forest. And it's that kind of, let's get out there, let's put the trees in the ground, let's take the satellite imagery, the drone imagery, and show people what we're doing, show them that with camera traps that we're getting ocelots and guans and a whole variety of other mammals and birds moving through these corridors, so that we're achieving the success of preventing species from extinction.
I think what we're looking at is someone is going to develop just out of sheer need. And I think this would probably happen with some of them for the $1 billion that you would receive if you had that call and got that check. Something on par of the revolutionary work that FedEx did with the delivery systems that they had, the logistics that they had to put together to do and Amazon for their delivery and their ordering systems and really big logistics systems. And you guys are starting because you've been doing the mapping and you know where hot spots are, in many, many, many cases where work is being or needs to be done. And putting all of that stuff together really would just take an umbrella of sheer logistics. It would be really interesting if someday you found yourself, or some group like yours found yourselves partners with people who led that charge in a commercial way to maybe bring that brain trust to conservation.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting analogy because it's a product that cannot be centralized. It's a product that has to be distributed. And I think the challenge for conservation is how do we get this massively distributed product of conservation action? It cannot be done in a centralized place. I can't do all the conservation that I want to do sitting in my office. I've got to get it to 100,000 different places, often remote, almost almost poor, with poor infrastructure. How do we get projects to people in these remote places? And we have fantastic people who are part of our partners organizations. Women who collect seeds and develop nurseries, entirely self-trained. They've just figured out how to go and grab seeds and put them in the ground and get them to grow. And I enjoy talking with these mostly women who do that work, and now earning much more money than their husbands, who are often poor farmers, do. But this sort of social empowerment, but really an extraordinary effort of getting people to do things that matter, at the place that matters. That's it's no good being FedEx if you can't get that package to the person who needs it in his in his remote house at the end of the street.
I think more exciting times are coming or are upon us in that area. To give anybody ideas of some things that you would love to see more people being interested in as they're choosing majors in college or even younger, what does that mean if you want to speak to the logistics thing or anything else in terms of the kind of help you would love to see from students? Or maybe you could share stories about what students you're working with now are doing that could be inspirational to younger folks coming up, trying to decide how they're going to spend their time helping.
Well, in just 7 hours' time, I'm going to go into a classroom and I'm going to talk to 40 students, a mixture of undergraduates and graduate students. It's a conservation class. Those students are from all over the world. Increasing numbers of them are from China, where we are being ever more engaged. I think what we can tell them is, there is hope. This is a problem that we have to solve, but we can solve. And I go to as much trouble as I can to give them a sense of empowerment, a sense that there are things that they can do. We need to be creative. There's no common one-size-fits-all project in conservation that what we might do in a community in Madagascar is different from what a colleague does, on the Maasai steppe of Tanzania, or what we do in Sumatra, or what we do in Assam. There are different local solutions. That those local solutions are often diverse and creative and surprising. But the important thing is that we try different things and we see what works, and we're prepared to be experimental, and above all to make sure that we're monitoring what's going on so we understand what works and what fails.
So dig in, come to meetings like yours, inform yourself, go to places like savingnature.com and find out. I was in grad school long ago doing geographic information studies, environmental geography, back when Esri and the mapping people were all just getting started with their technology, and it was very clunky back then, but it was my fascination with maps. And just the magic and wonder. I'm just looking at your coastal map of Brazil with the outline of the formerly forested area. And I look at that, I now know, in a different way than most people do. I get a kick out of that more than the average person does. So I was always really drawn to mapping. And then when we started doing the Sky Island work, after I met one of my heroes, Dave, and actually got lucky enough to work with him in the 90s on that very important project, one of the first of its kind, and there were maps everywhere. Just, that's what turned me on. And we were drawing lines where all of those lines were just possibilities and opportunities. The things inside those lines didn't exist yet, but we were imagining if the reconnections happened here, and we got this rancher to agree to this and the National Forest Service agreed to that. It was so exciting.
That's a wonderful project. I'm thrilled to be part of this interview, because I too have been inspired by what Dave and the others have done. I'm not the only. I don't want anybody to think I'm the only person building corridors. There's wonderful people building corridors, particularly in the western U.S. The Y2Y, the Yellowstone to Yukon initiative. A lot of these efforts where people realize that we've got to stitch nature back together again. And that sense of going back on the offensive, of saying we're not going to put up with all the bad things that have happened. We're going to fight back, and suddenly realize there's a lot of things we can do, and we can work on collaborations in some cases with people that you would never think as being likely partners. But there's an awful lot of people in the world who care about what sort of a planet they leave to their children and grandchildren. I think we have a lot of allies out there.
That's one of the plans that we have for Rewilding is to stitch together all the projects that we can find all over the world that are in and going and seeking volunteers, so someone could then use that database of everything that we could possibly get together. It's extremely ambitious, but we seem to be a hub. And you're a hub. Your organization is also a hub. People know to come to you. You have a network. And then in that case, it would be stitching all the networks together. So when you go to Saving Nature, this is a hub of activity connected to several projects all around the world. And then when you get that, you get a big chunk of data. Then show people how they can get involved. Give addresses, give names of volunteer coordinators, and how they can donate and exactly what the projects are about. Because the problem is everything is done in sound bites now. Social media is a big detriment to people's understanding of any deep knowledge. And they get very confused. They're starting to realize how big the world really is. And when they start to dig, there's no end to where the organizations that they find, the places that are asking for help, that are doing great work. And I think organizing all of that information so it's digestible, understandable, and it's searchable, and would go a long way into getting people focused in the right areas.
I think the important thing is that there's hope, and what we must do is to get people who want to make a difference to know that there's a lot of different ways in which they can make hope work.
So what was the first thing that you would like somebody to do when they come to your site today, when they hear this, when they're looking at Saving Nature? It's a pretty big site. It's got a lot of information. How do they not become overwhelmed? What's the first place you'd like them to go?
Other than the donate page, I have to say that because at some stage of the game, my executive director is going to be listening to this. The page that I'd like them to go to is the Brazil page, where we show the first corridor that we built, an area that was once just a barren cattle pasture that is now a forest that reconnects what was an isolated nature reserve. That's 10 years worth of work, but it shows you what you can accomplish in 10 years. And I'd like to do, 1,000 projects like that in the next 10 years.
You are a very connected person. I met you at a conference. I imagine you've admitted to traveling quite a bit, and networking with a lot of people. How many more groups are there similar to yours out there? Maybe not as big or small or whatever, but how do you feel about the network of groups like yours that are really connecting to the ground, to projects on the ground? Is it a big number? Is it a small number? Is it too small?
It's a small number. We have some really great partners. We do a lot of work with the small grants program of IUCN the Netherlands, because they give grants to small conservation groups around the world. There's another group in Britain called the World Land Trust. I think there's a number of small groups, all of whom are committed to helping the other small groups, the other small projects that I talked about that are populated by really great, fantastic people who are doing such a good job to save nature in their special parts of the world. And there's a lot of great people out there, and I hope people will go to the effort and find out where they are, and going through us and the other organizations I've mentioned are a way to come across those groups and to see how one can become involved.
Stuart, thank you so much for taking time. I am so excited. I hate to stop because I feel like we have so much more to talk about. And the only solution to that is that you must come back and talk to us some more, because this was really, really great. And I love the message of hope.
Thank you. It's there. You have a great day, and thank you so much for inviting me onto this program.
Thanks for listening to the Rewilding Earth podcast. Be sure to visit rewilding.org to subscribe so you don't miss past and future episodes. And while you're there, please consider supporting Rewilding by making a donation or subscribing to the Rewilding Earth newsletter.